Factual Reset, a podcast brought to you by the New Political Economy Initiative at IIT Bombay. From India's industrial shifts to lessons from the world over, our host for the season, Srinivasan Iyer, is unpacking the historical blueprints, the breakthroughs, and the contemporary bold lessons that reset our thinking on the economy.
We have with us today Dr. Ranja Sengupta. She's with the Third World Network based in Delhi. Thank you very much, Ranja, for agreeing to this interview.
Welcome, Srini.
Let's begin first with having you define how you will use the phrase industrial policy for this purpose. How would you define industrial policy in general?
For me, it would be creating through laws and regulations, basically an enabling environment in which the industry can grow. And that's the very basic, simple definition of industrial policy, and which means that the different elements of how this can be finally achieved has to be kind of part of that agenda, part of that policy framework. There has to be different elements. And so in the first place, many would think that it's leaving the industry alone to actually do their job, just create ease of doing business, and they will do, and they will kind of grow and they will do well. But we have seen over the years that unless there is and it's quite a complex structure actually, right? So in terms of firstly domestic sectoral policy, then there has to be different kinds of supportive policies which we will talk about later. So everything together, basically it creates that enabling environment for the industry to grow.
Can you please list out some key elements of industrial policy that you observe in contemporary India?
Yeah, I think for me, the first objective would be to create a market for that industry. Now, in a big country like India, it may seem like this is obvious. There's a ready-made market, but we know that there is, income inequality, etc., and that we are also now in a globalized world. So there would be competition from foreign producers, also from other countries. So in such a situation, how do you ensure, and then specific industries actually need specific markets, right? For example, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, on which we have worked a bit in our organization. We are kind of closely work on pharmaceutical and health related issues. So for example, for the domestic industry in India, or say in a developing country, we work really in the context of developing countries on their economic growth and development issues. So in developing countries, we have seen that for the generic pharmaceutical industry to grow, the assurance of market is very important. If only that they know they will be able to sell that, will they put in the R&D, the capital expenditure, etc., to kind of actually develop. They'll then invest what it takes. So that I think first thing is the assurance of market. Second thing, of course, we know the availability of finance and capital, either directly through private means or through government financial assistance. Then a third thing, I think, which is coming up, and in India we are seeing this a lot. We heard this in the new manufacturing policy of 2011. Now they are discussing there'll be a new industrial policy 2023. We really don't know what it will have, but I think one key issue which keeps coming up is technology, right? Like access to technology. And I have been part of some government consultations on trade issues and others where a lot of industry bodies were also present, and they also keep talking about that we need access to technology, and this will come up in every government policy document. I do think it's a key requirement, but how do you ensure that access to technology? And with that, I think the associated issue, what I was saying, that if you look at a straitjacket industrial policy, okay, finance, market, this, that, inputs, availability of inputs and storage and everything. But so these would be some of the main tracks. But with that, for example, the moment you want to ensure access to technology as a key objective, you must think also of the intellectual property rights kind of framework. What are those policy regimes? So for me, so one would be then access to technology should be a key objective, and then you need to look at supportive policies which can deliver on that objective. And and I think these things are key. And now, as part of technology, we know that digital technology is also coming up big way. And so how kind of do you ensure that digital technology then can be used by our industry for their development? I mean, it should be used for them to further their, for example, their access to market or their productive capacity, not kind of create divides. That's something we would want as part of the technology discussion. And yes, I think the last discussion is, of course, as part of availability of finance, the question of investment. And here, I mean, given my work area on trade and investment issues, I think foreign investment, how do you look at where do you want foreign direct investment? How do you shape it? How do you kind of design it, your foreign direct investment policy, that it can actually then help your industry to grow, to get benefit from it? And again, not get kind of, you do not want to have a foreign direct investment policy which would actually cut off their opportunities.
Thank you for this. Let's shift to what you've been working on, with is trade policy and related measures. Could you list out some of the key policy instruments within that rubric, and share with us your assessment? I mean, first of all, your assessment as to what economic objectives they seek to serve in India today, and whether they will be able to meet those objectives given contemporary domestic and global conditions.
Right. I mean, exactly. I mean, I work on trade policy, and but what we've been recently seeing, and very well, is this re-emergence of the discussion on industrial policy in linkage to trade policy, actually. So the whole industrial policy discourse is, of course, coming back big time, because now the developed countries are very interested, right? So we know the US and the EU, Germany, many big economic superpowers are really talking about that they also need industrial policy. Whereas for, I have worked in the trade domain, but also a lot on the 2030 agenda on sustainable development, for example. And there the discussion you see, for example, the African countries continuously talking about the need for structural transformation, the need for an enabling industrial policy, and therefore that links automatically the discussion, that links to the discussion on trade policy. So what kind of a trade policy would they need, developing countries, that would help them achieve the kind of industrial policy that they would finally want? So in a way, your final goal is to have that enabling industrial policy, and identifying, as we were just discussing, what would be the objectives, what would be the deliverables, and then you make sure your trade policy, your foreign direct investment policy, your IPR policy, everything caters to that objective of finally what you want in terms of your industrial policy. So, in the trade policy discussion, India has been a member of the WTO since 1995, and before that of GATT. And now they are signing a number of bilateral and also regional free trade, what we call free trade agreements, that bilateral trade agreements between two countries, or now we have these regional, we've heard of the TPP, then India engaged in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, right? And India pulled out of it. And then India is now joining, it has already joined the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, for Economic Framework for Prosperity. It's called, it has a long, complicated name, as these agreements tend to have. So what India has been pretty cautious on what we call liberalization, reduction of import duties, especially on agriculture sector, because agriculture is seen to be a sensitive sector. India has been, I would say, less cautious on the industrial tariffs, So one key element, of course, we know of trade policy elsewhere, and also the key discussion of all the trade agreements, whether it's at the WTO, multilateral agreements at the WTO, or these bilateral agreements or regional plurilateral agreements. First thing is, of course, import duties, tariff reduction, what you call in straight terms liberalization. And India has actually reduced industrial tariffs to now about like average of actual applied duties of 7-8%. So it has played kind of very bold. I think it has tried to implement the ASEAN example, that they lowered their tariffs and they have done very well in terms of their industrial growth and even exports. So India thought of kind of following that policy. Then another key element in all these trade discussions is, of course, investment. How much liberalization of investment will a country do? And India, especially in the industrial sector, India has almost fully liberalized. It is more cautious again on agriculture and just a few service sectors, but on manufacturing, even on mining and extractives, it has largely opened up, and most services also. But what remains to be done in a way, I mean, apart from just opening up markets, is also how do you regulate? What would be the rules for foreign investment? What kind of rights will they enjoy? What kind of policies will you have to attract foreign investment, and simply not opening of markets, but also what kind of policies will you have to regulate foreign investment? What kind of limitations will you have on foreign investors' rights to ensure that your domestic industrialization can actually progress, right? And then another issue which we kind of, for example, when the WTO agreements were being negotiated, the intellectual property rights was not an issue that developing countries wanted, right? They did not, because they were not the ones who actually owned intellectual property rights. They were not the owner of technology or innovation, etc. so much. This was mainly being done by the rich countries, and they were the ones who were interested in having standards and rules on intellectual property rights, so that those innovations, technology, those monopoly rights over those innovations or technology could be protected, because these were mainly coming from the global north countries. But in a way, it is said that, why did developing countries agree to the TRIPS agreement? One was they were worried that the US was going to take unilateral measures against them on different areas and also on technology. And the other thing is they were told that they'll benefit a lot from the agriculture agreement, the AOA, and therefore in return they agreed to the TRIPS agreement, which brought in these standards of intellectual property protection. So intellectual property rights and how then it links to technology and access and transfer of technology has become a key part of all trade agreements since the TRIPS agreement came. And in the FTAs, we see, in fact, standards of IPR chapters going way beyond what the TRIPS agreement does. I mean, we have, as trade policy activists, for example, it has impacts not only just in terms of access to technology for industry, because it is actually protecting, technology. It is kind of it has kept it in the global north. And this includes environmental technologies, right? That has emerged in the north, often with public research and public money, but it has been privately controlled through patents and different kinds of other intellectual property. So it has definitely had a major impact on technology, but we see IPR and technology transfer, this linked package, becoming a very, very aggressive agenda, I would say, of the global north countries in all trade agreements, and they have become a very, very important part which has to be negotiated by developing country governments, including Indian government.
So can you share some more specific examples of India's current position, be it adopted policy or negotiating stance, and how whether that would help advance the Indian economic objective of increasing the share of market of manufacture in the domestic economy, as well as rapidly increasing exports in an increasingly more sophisticated package of exports.
Right.
So can you be more specific whether there are certain features with either aid or may obstruct these objectives?
Exactly. So that has been, I think the objective of every government through its trade policy is to advance its national interest, right? And therefore, the interest of, say, its own industry, for sure. And the government, of course, like Indian government has, as I was saying, like one thing they keep talking about is ensuring export markets, right? So one is they are wanting to make the industry competitive so that it can like do well in export markets, and also that it can actually protect itself, it can hold its own against imports. So even if it opened up imports, the government kind of says, and it is kind of also in theory, it's much talked about, that if you open up and if you allow imports and if you then kind of provide a lot of competition for the domestic industry, it will actually increase their competitiveness. If you protect too much and if you kind of mollycoddle the industry, then they kind of become uncompetitive, and we have seen this has partly happened with the Indian industry.
Do you want to share some
Yes.
sectoral examples
Yeah,
on this?
absolutely, I will. But what we have seen in case of, as I was saying, this has happened partly in the case of Indian industry, but at the same time, what we have seen, what you were asking for, like in real terms, examples where premature liberalization, premature reduction of import duties, and then opening up to foreign imports has been disastrous for many industries and many sectors. I think first example we had seen was actually in the edible oil sector. Why is India the one of the largest importers? Why is one of the largest Indian imports is of vegetable oil? India is a major agricultural country. It's one of the topmost producers of oilseeds in the world. But what had happened was India had quantitative restrictions on processed oil, on imports of edible oil. It had quantitative restrictions. When it joined the WTO, as a part of that commitment, it had to remove those quantitative restrictions, and it could not raise import duties. As a result, you see that our agriculture sector, which was relatively protected, has still continued to, even under difficult conditions, no investment, this, that, not much policy support, but they had managed to still survive, and we are one of the major exporters of rice and other agricultural products. But in terms of processed agricultural products, especially vegetable oil, that is our biggest agriculture import burden actually, because we are totally dependent on Latin American countries, on Indonesia and other countries for import of vegetable oil, and because of that premature liberalization, the processing capacity has got totally destroyed, which is we are still struggling to actually develop our own Indian oil processing sector. The other example is, of course, of automobiles. Automobiles is actually a positive example, I would say. In fact, let me go before that to maybe another problematic example, but that shows what premature liberalization can do. India signed on to the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement 1, Chapter 1 under the WTO, which was a plurilateral agreement, and India was doing well in the IT sector, and both in terms of the services as well as hardware, and it thought that it would make the industry more competitive. That was the stated objective as part of its India's historical industrial policy statements. And then what happened was, when we opened up, we removed import duties on these products. You now see that our IT, the services sector is, that's also now facing problem, but they were booming, they did well, but our hardware industry got destroyed because of ITA 1, and this the government has acknowledged. That's why they have been much more cautious about signing on to ITA phase 2. And this has been a major blow, because this was one industry which was on the verge of taking off, could have done well, but this got cut off because of maybe mismanaged and not enough vision in the trade policy decisions. But the positive example, what I was talking about, is the automobile industry. India decided to kind of take this kind of twin strategy, but also along with another third prong. But the main two elements were to have high import duties. So India still has on automobile between 15 to, but it goes up to 115%.
On finished.
Finished cars, bound duties. These are bound means maximum duties. And with that, it opened up foreign direct investment. So therefore, kind of giving out the message that anybody who wants to get benefit from this emerging market of the automobile sector will, if they want to access the Indian market, they will have to invest here. So therefore, they generate, they increase domestic production, they create local jobs, there is transfer and diffusion of technology. And they kept import duties high. So that's how the automobile sector has, taken the shape and dimension that it has taken today. But now you see that, as I said, India has been cautious, say, about ITA too. But now, even in the WTO and especially in its free trade agreements, now we are negotiating with northern countries. India initially signed with a lot of developing countries, but now we are negotiating with the European Union for a long time, which got kind of which fell into an impasse in between, but now it's been, from last year, it's fully revived. We are negotiating with Canada, with New Zealand, Australia. We already have an agreement with Japan. UK is a big one. EU and UK, I would say, are the immediate and the biggest FTAs on the horizon. But then we may also have an FTA with the US, and there's also the IPEF and so on, which is, IPEF is supposedly on paper not a normal trade agreement in the sense there's no market access. But if you read between the lines, there'll have to be a lot of concessions on policy and regulatory issues, which would finally, in a way, lead to market access, though it's not on paper. So, but in these, India is now, there is tremendous pressure to open up the automobile sector. And the automobile sector themselves are very worried about this. That, it's not that they are still not ready. Maybe they would need 10 years more or 15 years more to be able to kind of actually be fully competitive, where you do not need protection anymore. And so it's kind of on the verge of, in a way, destroying all the advantage and all the benefit it had created for the domestic automobile sector. So, another area is dairy, where dairy has been, especially processed dairy. Our dairy sector is now about to produce things like cheese and different processed products, but that sits also on this pyramidal structure of very small dairy farmers. We have a lot of cooperatives like Amul and all, and that industry is just about to take off. I'm not even talking about milk production, I'm talking about dairy as an industry, and that's about to take off. But that is example of one industry which really is linked to small stakeholders, and in a way not even wage workers, but small producers who are actually producers in their own right, But dairy is again another sector where India is under tremendous pressure to open up. So in the EU FTA, in FTA, with Canada, with US, everybody, and New Zealand, Australia, of course, the big dairy exporters, they want dairy industry to be opened up, and we know that the domestic dairy industry is very worried, and it's not, and so that is one. So these industries are not only because of early import duty liberalization, where India had held out on dairy, on automobiles, they had held out, but all these, it could be, unless the government really takes a more visionary, more long-term kind of position, that if India decides to open these up, then actually we would see a tremendous kind of a regression in terms of their industrial development. And instead of an progressive industrial policy, it would lead to really a regression, So those are some of the example in terms of, say, market access. And then, of course, there are other examples related to IPR that is coming through the pharmaceutical industry also there.
So why don't you share something more on the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah.
Everything, there's trade policy, FDIs, IPRs, and how the ups and downs of the Indian pharmaceutical industry have been influenced by these key industrial policy decisions.
Exactly. Pharmaceutical industry has been like one of, I think, along with automobile and garments and all, of course, but automobile and pharmaceuticals are kind of known to be the two industries which have really benefited from a proactive government-led industrial policy, like active shaping and designing of industrial policy for these segments, which has really helped them grow. And so for pharmaceutical industry, as I was talking about the TRIPS agreement and IPR, and India had cleverly in 1970 allowed only process patents. In the 1970 Act, they did not allow patents on products. So on the final product, they did not allow. And this had helped the generic pharmaceutical industry to really grow, and to the extent that they were supplying 67%, I think, of the developing world's medicine needs. That's like a huge achievement. And that's why we, as Indian citizens, we could get access to cheap, generic medicines. In fact, I am a rheumatoid arthritis patient, and the medicine that's like a biologic drug called Humira, that's supposed to be, I don't have to take it yet, thank God, but that medicine costs 80,000 rupees per injection, and a patient would need 2 per month. So that's 1,60,000, and that is one of the most expensive patented medicines in the world. But India, actually, I believe that we have generic versions available for 8,000 rupees. I mean, it's still expensive, but it's way lower than what it would cost otherwise. So for many critical diseases, Indian generic industry had been able to produce. But then, because of the TRIPS agreement for the compliance requirements, we had to kind of enact our patent law recognizing product patents in 2005. And since then, you will see that the generic medicines are being pushed out. And I mean, maybe I should just say in one line, very simply, what is it? Like, it's basically that big pharmaceutical companies, they bring out, and we know from the example of the Pfizer vaccines and all, right? Like, they patent it immediately, therefore they have monopoly control, therefore they can set the price wherever they want because they are the only producer. And so in every country, fortunately, this is not a right which is like one patent is globally recognized. In every country, they have to apply for the patent, and if that patent is granted, then they have monopoly right in that country. And by that 2005 Patent Act, now we have to recognize and grant this right to every producer, which means for critical medicines, when a medicine comes out, even when it's been funded by public research, by taxpayers' money, maybe not in India, maybe in US, but whereas from public money, even then the companies are actually making huge profits, like we've seen in case of the COVID vaccines. And the companies can give voluntary licenses to smaller companies to produce, but it's totally up to them. For example, Pfizer declared after some time that we are not going to give voluntary licenses anymore, right? Because voluntary licenses are often pitched as the solution. Like, okay, the technology is patented by, say, a Western company, a US-based company or whatever, but then we will give licenses to companies so that developing countries and least developed countries, these companies will produce and sell to them at a cheaper price, not in the main market, but in these smaller markets, which is not interesting enough for the big companies. But we see that increasingly, like, voluntary license has become very political. Whether they will actually give the license, what kind of conditions they impose, has been very difficult. And then in the so through the WTO, we had to already institute product patent, and therefore the generic companies are already under tremendous pressure. They do something like a reverse engineering, like a copy medicine. What they ensure is they ensure cheap medicines for us, and if your quality control measures, etc., are in place, these generic medicines have kind of actually really kind of catered to the needs of developing country patients across developing countries. And now in the FTAs, we are also having to agree to provisions which even take us beyond TRIPS. So for example, even if a medicine is off patent, that data cannot be used by a smaller company to market. They know how to produce it, they are producing it, but they cannot market it. They will not get marketing approval. They'll have to repeat clinical trials, which smaller companies cannot do. So the whole IPR regime that's coming in through the WTO, and more so through this bilateral and regional, the new agreements, create massive problem for access to technology. So for our pharmaceutical industry, now it's on the decline. You can see many buoyant, like very successful small generic pharma companies are now selling out. and they can just sell and go. And it's not only IPR, it's also the investment, the FDI policy in pharmaceuticals, because in FDI policy they have allowed 100% FDI in the brownfield. Okay, so brownfield, in greenfield and in brownfield. In brownfield, they have allowed 75% automatic route, which means there's no approval or nothing is even needed, and 25% is through government approval. But this has been a major fear among health activists that this would mean that there would be a lot of takeover of generic companies by big, what we call big pharma, Western big pharmaceutical companies, and that has already, it's happening, it's already happening. We can see this in India. But if you take the case of Bangladesh and Nepal, our neighboring countries, where we have been working actively, because they are least developed countries, so they did not have to implement the TRIPS agreement. They didn't have to bring in product patents. But now Bangladesh is about to graduate, like it will graduate in 2026. Nepal will also graduate. Bangladesh has a buoyant pharmaceutical industry. They produce certain basic drugs. They have started exporting. They are doing very well. And that's why in Bangladesh, a lot of these cheap medicines are available. And as I said, they have started exporting to many other LDCs and developing countries. Nepal pharmaceutical industry is not that advanced, but still it is there. It is producing certain medicines. They will have, once they bring in product patent, they will face the same challenge that India faced after 2005, and their medicines will be, medicine prices will be going up like many times, And so these countries, they are bringing in new patent laws, and the TRIPS agreement provides certain flexibilities for developing countries so that they can ensure access to medicine. But all these safeguards need to be, fully incorporated into their laws, and many of them actually are not doing it. And frankly, let me say here also that the technical assistance that comes from some of these global institutions like the WTO or the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, are very problematic, because they will actually tell them how to, you can get more patents on this, and this is how you should attract the patent holders, you give them patents, etc. But what they really kind of do not want countries enough against is how do you actually build in all these safeguards? How do you maximize that potential? You have signed on to the WTO agreements, you've signed the TRIPS agreement, you will have to comply, but at least you make the best out of that problematic situation, and that kind of good advice they actually do not get from the international institutions. So pharmaceutical industry remains one major kind of example, I think, where trade policy has been a big problem.
Both ups and downs.
And
within pharmacy, also a related issue of global pharmaceutical majors influencing domestic ones are through these revenue sharing or licensing agreements.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is also where also there is room for the government to intervene and lay down what's in the interest of Indian industry. So can you share a couple of examples in recent times, good or bad?
I am not so, in the sense that there were license sharing examples, say over the COVID vaccine with they were producing. But the thing is, these licensing agreements have been, you are very right that these licensing agreements are a major tool through which the global pharma companies control. Because these licensing agreements, the terms of these licensing companies, of these agreements, are often very adverse, and they will limit these companies to a certain market, to a certain limit their access to technology, like it's only for a certain purpose and not beyond. So those kind of issues have been there, and which, like for example, some of my colleagues who work on this have been raising, many other health organizations have been raising, because even in the WTO you will see that these licensing agreements are kind of volunteered as the solution, that you do not need to kind of address or change the patent regime or the IPR regime, because the licensing agreements are there, they will solve the problem. And we've seen, like in this whole vaccine sharing, all the facilities that were set up internationally also, they have actually, I mean, they were kind of depending on the global big pharma to donate and get into these licensing agreements, which actually is totally shaped and controlled by them. So they have not led to the desirable results.
And there was little by way of technological catch-up by the domestic industry. Let's also turn to the current discussions around sustainability, as you'd mentioned earlier, and how, what's the sort of state of play there? How should India play that to push along its domestic economic objectives?
Exactly. I mean, good that you raise the issue of sustainability, because this is the big discussion now in industrial policy. Of course, you see any document, I guess, not only of the Indian government, but governments everywhere, especially developing countries and these developed country governments. And they are all saying that we will use industrial policy to ensure higher sustainability standards for the industry, that ensure that the industry is able to meet globally acceptable sustainability standards. And we know that in many of the developed countries, they have not only upgraded their own production, but they will not accept your products unless you meet those standards. And in a way, unilaterally, a lot of the developed countries, US, EU in particular, have been laying down these standards, in any case unilaterally and also through the trade agreements. But now I think we have started to see, in a way, a new era of the sustainability standards and this argument on sustainability being used as a tool to suppress developing countries economically. I mean, what we understand, and even the 2030 agenda, the key understanding and the new thing, which was different from the Millennium Development Goals, is that sustainability has 3 dimensions: economic, social and environmental. And all through the negotiation of the 2030 agenda, this was very important. And developing countries continuously said that for us, the economic development is also important. While we want to have environmental sustainability, meet sustainability standards, we also need, for example, to provide jobs and incomes and to feed our people. So if these dimensions have to be there has to be a balance. And this is what it's recognized globally, but we do see that now, and let me say that I'm for, of course, our industry meeting sustainability standards. I don't think we will even exist within maybe the next decade or 2 decades if we do not really raise our game and kind of meet these environmental norms, etc. Right now. In fact, it's already late. But at the same time, these cannot be used. These standards are being, what we see coming through the trade agreement, that the trade spaces are very commercial spaces. They're commercially driven. Even actually a negotiation on fisheries subsidies, which is supposed to be, again, in the name of sustainability and ensuring marine conservation, etc., right? But it becomes harshly commercial because it's it's driven by economic interest, right? But the thing is that in that trade space, we see now environment and sustainability, and these are in a way issues which nobody can say no to. Everybody wants them, right? These are like the global public good kind of thing. But we see that the way they are being brought in by the developed countries is to lay down standards in a way that developing countries cannot actually catch up. And when they move, when we kind of in these economies, we move to the green transition pathways, we use more environmental friendly products and services, our producers, our industry will not be supplying. We will be buying directly from developed countries. The way they have pushed the environmental goods and services agreement, and now, like a lot of they are bringing in these joint statement initiatives on the environment and trade issues. And it's not only multilateral, also, through specific sectoral tracks. In agriculture, if you see, there is sustainability and agricultural trade. So the sustainability issue is being brought into every track, but we are very, very concerned that it is actually to ensure more market for the West. And they have, as you were saying, that they have reached they can meet some of these standards. They have put in huge amount of capital and and finance and research into development of those technologies, And even in the climate discussion, this is a contentious issue that they do not want to, they have historical responsibility, what we call common but differentiated responsibility, but they have repeatedly refused, while they're imposing these standards and expect us to produce and consume, in a certain way, in an environmentally kind of a sustainable way, but they have refused to give either the finance or the technology, which they control. Again, we come back to IPR. IPR is the main tool through which they control these technologies. And if we have to buy these technologies, they are very expensive. So on the one hand, they are not willing to give us these technologies, but they are laying down standards through the trade agreements. Whereas if we do not meet the standards which is laid down by them, our industry will not be able to sell to them. So I have seen the industry being very worried. They are trying here in India, whatever discussions I've had with many industry bodies over the trade agreements, that they are worried about these standards because they are trying to meet these sustainability standards, and the government is ostensibly, trying to support them in enabling them to meet these standards. But when you look at the trade agreements, they will be cut off. They will neither have access to these technologies, but they cannot export. And in fact, even in our own markets, if we if we are forced to implement those standards, then actually even our own industry will not be supplying the goods and services to us. And so this has become, I think, increasingly, it's a high focus issue in the WTO, in the FTAs. And I will give you an example. We are negotiating an FTA with the European Union. As I said, it has been revived since last year. And there's a new chapter. So in the earlier phase of the negotiation, which was 2007 to 2013, this chapter wasn't there. So there is a stronger sustainable development chapter, which was already there. Now we see a much bigger and much fleshed out form of the sustainable chapter, which has certain environmental kind of provisions and standards and things. But there's also an energy and raw material chapter, which again kind of preaches sustainability in a way, but that kind of says government cannot give any preference or any subsidies, for example, to develop domestic energy, which means even renewable energy projects. Our government cannot give preferential treatment to Indian industry on renewable energy projects, right? And at the same time, so they have these or we cannot subsidize, we cannot give them a price preference, like government cannot have a policy which gives them any price preference, etc. But at the same time, issues like the investment protection agreements, we know, like there are those investment protection agreements, India had signed about 82, it's now trying to renegotiate, because a lot of these agreements give very strong protection to the foreign investor. Their rights are sacrosanct. So if an Indian company invested in India today, their rights are not that strong. But if any foreign company comes and invests in India, their rights are protected under these investment agreements. And that says that if any government brings in environmental conservation measures, then the company can challenge if it is reducing their profits. So, and they can then sue these governments in international secret arbitration cases. It's not under the purview of the domestic court at all. It's in like under World Bank, or there's a UN body also. So there are these international arbitration tribunals which will be set up. These cases are secret, and more than 50% cases are in natural resources, actually, with these mining companies and extractives and the companies who are actually polluting land, polluting water and even grabbing land, but they have their rights are protected under these investment treaties.
You mean global investors in the global south, global north investors are protecting their rights.
So they are protecting their rights across the global south, and most of our countries have signed on to many of these investment protection agreements. But also these are also part of the FTAs. Like you can have such investment protection chapters in the FTAs. So what I'm saying is there's tremendous doublespeak here. On the one hand, the developed countries are showing their commitment, so-called, to sustainability, and they are bringing it into trade agreements. We think with actually a very market-driven agenda, it is to ensure markets for their corporations, whereas the real issues like the, how such investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms work under the investment protection, how are the rights of a polluter, of a foreign company which is polluting water in a developing country or grabbing resources, these rights are protected, these are not addressed. So, I mean, there's a tremendous gap between what trade policy, especially the sustainability issue is concerned, what trade policy says, like, or rather the rich countries say that they are trying to do in terms of global trade rules, and what is actually the real picture. And the fact is that in terms of industrial policy, it will cut off.
So, I mean, you draw attention to a paradox there where global north investors stand to benefit both ways, so where they pollute, the investment agreements protect them,
right,
and where they have clean technologies, they push through trade agreements.
So they are protecting their market advantage in every way.
So in this context, say if India wants to have socially desirable goals, either health for all or in fact a domestic clean industry, should it be led by pressure from these global trade agreements, or should it do domestic industrial policy to get its manufacture ready?
Exactly. I mean, I think India is saying that it's going to bring in sustainability measures, right? Like, which is enabling, I would think that, for example, in the new Industrial Policy 2023, which is supposed to come out sometime, maybe in October or November, I'm not sure, but they have talked about that they will bring in issues related to sustainability. So we think they will have enabling policies for the industry to adopt these kind of standards and technology and measures. And then they will talk about technology transfer and IPR. So in some of these, what they are trying to do domestically, what they say they are trying to do, and I think the government is committed on some of these aspects, but they will find when they put together what they are doing in trade policy or what they are doing in terms of their FDI policy, they will find major conflicts. So we have always said that you have to protect domestic policy space. So that has to be sacrosanct. In no trade agreement should you give away this policy space. So the trade agreement, fine, if you want to sign something, as long as it's mutually beneficial. I mean, maybe governments, in any case, they are signing, right? There are a lot of trade agreements are being signed all the time. But the fact is that how do you protect your domestic policy space, industrial policy space? Now digital economy is coming up big time, and our governments, especially developing countries, we have not formulated our digital policies yet. How will we protect our data? How will we, like if it is public data, government data, I mean there can be sensitive government data, that is pushed through the trade agreements to kind of make it freely flowing across the globe. And which means that it will freely flow to where the sources, where such technology, the origin is actually, and that's in the global north, right? So America owns most of the digital companies are there, or in Europe. So, and I mean maybe some in China, but the fact is that the digital corporations want free flow of data, and they are pushing it through the trade agreements. But most of the developing countries, we have not come up with what our digital policy should look like. For example, what will be the policy on startups? Like, the digital startups that many are coming up in India, they are doing very well. And the minister also recently said that we will give a boost to the startups. And I think even the new industrial policy mentions that there will be support for startups, startup companies. A lot of them will be in the digital sector. But the fact is that if you liberalize data fully, and that means whatever preferential treatment you will give to Indian startup companies, you will have to open it up to all foreign digital companies, startup companies, then it does not make sense. Then we will be nowhere. So I think absolutely India has to keep its industrial policy, its digital policy, which would become part of its industrial policy, I guess. All these it has to really work out, and then it has to see what kind of trade policy, FDI policy, IPR policy will cater to those objectives, and you then do not compromise on the policy space that you need for delivering on those objectives.
So thank you for these specific references and analysis, if we pull back a bit, what you've just discussed with us in terms of the implications of trade policy and intellectual property regimes and even investment, FDI, has such a significant imprint on the shape of economic activity. Now, is there also something theoretically that disposes not merely the problems that you set out for India, but even the global turn towards industrial policy? Does it in fact challenge certain theoretical precepts that mainstream economic thinking has to take into consideration?
In the sense that mainstream economic theory has always been what the developed countries wanted, right? Like that is, you should not protect, you should not, even wherever you are on your development pathway, you should keep markets open, and you should actually have IPR, because the standard theory is that IPRs actually foster innovation, and that will lead to better technology, more access to technology globally being available, and so on. And that foreign investment on any terms is critical. Like, there is so much harping, even in our industrial policies, on getting foreign direct investment, especially for very poor countries. One can understand that they cannot generate the investment they have domestically. But lot of these policy theories are really now being debunked. That you should have unfettered market liberalization, that it will help you to become competitive, it will help your industry to become competitive. We've seen many cases where it does not. Then that foreign investment.
Would you see, for example, the EU's imposition of environmental standards as a case of fettering markets? In a sense, they're pulling away from unfettered markets?
I think it's definitely partly a protectionist policy for themselves, which has been, even their sustainable development chapter, which they have been putting in their free trade agreement texts, like they have a template for decades now. So those have always been known as partly as protectionist measures, but at the same time, it's also an offensive agenda. It's also grabbing of markets across the global south, ensuring that their market control remains intact.
Without making available affordable technology or investment funds.
In technology is the biggest instrument. Investors are coming into some of these countries, but only if they can get an unfettered kind of access to these markets. They do not have any problem in sending back money home. They are not controlled by, for example, any progressive technology. Like what you were mentioning just now, that question, what you were saying that what it would be even a socially or economically desirable policy, part of that would be protecting the environment or labor, right? Like labor rights, for example. But we've seen that the foreign investors do not want, like they have used these investment treaties to challenge labor laws. In Egypt, for example, there was a case where they were bringing in this minimum wage act, and a French company sued them. Actually, I think they lost the case, but that shows, and they are attacking labor regulations across a number of global south countries. So workers' rights are not protected under these, but investors' rights are. Actually, and in fact, many of these agreements you will see these days, that's then another interesting thing, because you talked about, in a way, the social benefit, and therefore employment, livelihoods becomes an important part, and industrial policy, new industrial policy, every industrial policy, manufacturing policy keeps talking about employment generation, etc., though it's never enough, and it's actually, there's not enough solid policy backing when they say that they will create employment. But even then, when you are talking about livelihoods and employment, that is the interesting thing, that they never kind of seem to take into account the fallout from some of these investment rules and agreements that could have on labor rights, or protection on environmental rights, and so on. So from a social perspective, we've seen a major kind of challenge from the trade agreements, which in a way kind of, like protecting labor rights within our industrial policy, promoting employment, or bringing in sustainability standards, which some of these could have been plugged domestically, but actually the trade agreements threaten that. And public health, like our example of the pharmaceutical industry and what is happening, that is creating a major challenge to public health and health rights, within India is also an example of that.
You also give an example, like the Egyptian one on labor rights, of companies which were causing domestic environmental degradation, which protected in fact prevented national governments. So can you just share a couple of examples, even if you don't need to name them?
Yeah, I will share, but also there's been a study, very interesting, I think, study by UNCTAD, which shows that 1/3 of the recent cases between 2016 and now, the paper came out maybe last year or something, and it shows that these were all climate related, where it blocked government's efforts to bring in climate conservation efforts, policies. So those kind of things were blocked by the ISDS investment treaty cases. And in fact, in
You
Peru,
mean the global South governments wanted to take action?
Yeah, it is not necessarily North-South,
Yeah.
but it is where governments wanted to take environment conservation measures. The foreign investors using these investment treaties sued them, and they could not, in most cases, they could not go forward with those climate related measures, right, in spite of having committed in the Paris Agreement or whatever. There's been a very interesting case in Peru, which is actually an environment and health kind of issue together, is where in this, there's this company, US company called Renco, and they had invested in a factory over there, and this is in a province called Le Oroya, and the water stream got polluted because of the factory. And then 169 children either died or they were disabled, they had different diseases, because, and it was linked to the water pollution coming from the Renco factory. The government asked them to clean up the stream and stop activities. They sued the government for $8 million, saying that their profits were being kind of infringed on through that. And so I think they won one case, I think, but another case they lost.
So in a sense, one, industrial policy therefore includes labor safeguards and environmental safeguards, but also that global trade agreements or global investment agreements can either create obstacles in such domestic policy or actually advance these goals, whichever way it might be.
Right. And but then I think there is scope for global South governments to still, because many of them still haven't signed on so many FTAs with the northern countries. I think they need to understand this whole paradigm, this linked paradigm of what they see as a purely domestic policy, which is their industrial policy paradigm, but then associated with that, what kind of trade policy, investment agreements, trade agreements, and IPR, related agreements, commitments they are taking up, and all these are legally binding. Remember, so whether they put in place their industrial policy or not, they will have to implement the commitments under these other trade investment agreements. So they really need to look at the whole picture together, and then I think secure and protect the policy space, and that requires a lot of detailed research and analysis and understanding, not only in the immediate term but medium and long term, of what some of these the associated policies that you are actually signing, kind of sometimes pretty arbitrarily, what would they mean for even for your domestic policy space, for your domestic industrial policy, which many governments think, oh, this is my thing, I will decide this, and I will do it this way. But the commitments they are taking on continuously through these other agreements will actually not allow them to do that.
Thank you very much, Ranja, for this.
Thank you very much, Srini, for this discussion. It was great.
That was Ranja Sengupta from the Third World Network.